Hello and welcome to Say Hi to the Future, Ingenious Thinkers, a podcast aimed at highlighting the human side of ingenuity. My name is Ken Tencer, curator of Say Hi to the Future, helping leaders think differently in the face of uncertainty and ambiguity. Better thinking, better outcomes.
But I believe that if we focus more on a servant leadership mentality and focus on ushering in kindness first, that's the kickstart. Kindness is key. If leaders understood and understand that if we lead with kindness, start with kindness, the empathy that we're going to need to lead, to inspire and lead our teams comes from that. It comes from kindness. And the resilience through challenges and obstacles, either for our teams that we're leading or for ourselves, are going to come from that team approach. Understand that this person is a kind person before they are a CEO. This person is a kind person before they're a VP. So I really tried to get the title out the way and draw out that characteristic of kindness, to know that I'm when I'm talking to a staff or giving feedback or direction, I'm talking to a human being. Where's the kindness in my tone, in my instruction, in my willingness to see them succeed? And then even amongst each other, it's when people come up with good ideas, it's not just saying, well, that's a great idea. How can I add to that idea to see it come to life? That's the kindness that we need in order to lead and inspire teams. And that's what the Kickstart's all about.
Yeah, investors are attending, are listening to events and conferences and gatherings related to ag tech. And in fact, there are more and more of these gatherings and conferences globally that you'll see, which I didn't see a number of years ago. But whether they're showing up to invest in female-led or companies, or whether they're investing or interested in those areas, I really can't necessarily answer that to the extent that I haven't seen that actively happen yet, but we remain hopeful. What I think is really hopeful is that there are more and more female investors and funds that are led by women, and they are very interested in good innovation, obviously, that works. But they have another eye out also for smart and talented women. So I do see that emerging. A friend of mine, or a colleague in this industry of mine, Connie Bowen, and her business partner, Suma Reddy, started Farmhand Ventures, for example. And I think they're interested in investing in obviously really awesome ag tech companies, but also have a special eye out for women. So those are some examples. And that's positive. But I mean, we still need to kind of solve this greater issue of, one thing is to have interest, which is wonderful, and we want that to continue. The other thing is actually to get folks to invest. And the third part of that investment is, well, how many of these companies are offering a return?
Sure.
We have a whole ocean of ag tech startups, and which ones will remain?
Firstly, what is transformative storytelling versus telling a story?
So the storytelling that we do helps connection and belonging and safety. And so when we're telling our stories, that's the whole goal of the work that we're doing. And so we want the people who come into our spaces to feel safety, connected, and belonging. Because we find that a majority of the spaces that we're invited into, people don't feel safe. They don't trust. They don't feel like they belong. They don't feel like they're connected. And when people don't feel those things, they're working from 5% of their brain. So when people don't feel connected and safety and belonging, they're working from their lower brain or their emotional brain, where they're not able to be creative and solutions based. And so the only way to get out of the lower part of your brain is to cultivate safety, connection, and belonging. And so through the storytelling work that we do, that's the goal that we do. That's why we call it transformative. So through that storytelling, we're regulating ourselves, and we're co-regulating with each other, and we're moving into a space where hopefully by the end, everybody is feeling that sense of safety, connection, and belonging, so that they're working from the executive part of their brain. And when they work from that part of their brain, they can be creative and courageous and solutions-based, and they're able to say things that they might not have been able to say before if they were in their lower part of their brain.
Well, that's really cool. Sorry, lousy descriptor. I've never heard or understood it that way, that connectivity opens up 95% of our brain or our capacity in that sense. So is that why you call it whole systems healing, that you're enabling, you're enabling your whole self, if you will, to become engaged and to heal cohesively?
Yeah, it's the promotion of that whole systems healing when we're doing that work, because I talk a lot about colonialism in our work and then decolonizing. And people always say, well, what does colonialism mean to you? And I always say, to me, colonialism means systems based off of fear and control. And so if we want to decolonize our systems, we have to start working from that place of trust and faith and love. And when we do that, we're able to show up in different ways. And in order to do that, we have to do some healing. And so when we're coming into spaces, a lot of times people just want to get to business. They just want to let's get into the strategy. Let's start trying to figure out how to do this. And yet majority of us are working from 5% of our brain a majority of the time. And so doing this work is asking us all to do some of that healing so that we can show up as our full selves, so that we can show up as fully human and everything that we know, and trusting our instincts and how we contribute to spaces. Because when we're not working from that full brain and that full body and that everything that makes you human, we hold back and we don't fully share our brilliance with each other.
I've never met a mother, whether in Nairobi, Kenya, or on the west side of the city of Chicago, who wanted to stand in a line to feed her family.
Right.
And providing the investments in the market-based businesses that can increase the access to affordable, nutritious food, provide jobs, and build wealth in communities is why I started the Food Systems for the Future.
Mm-hmm.
Because I wanted us as a community of actors to move beyond, yes, providing that social safety net for people who, when they fall through the cracks, we know that they have access to nutritious food, but performing the preemptive emergency humanitarian action by investing in communities, investing in businesses, scaling up businesses, providing opportunities to increase the capacity of business, the partnerships and the policies that will give those a market-based system the ability to provide food at an affordable and nutritious price everywhere for everyone. And that was why I started Food Systems for the Future.
The world of ESG today has mainly three big problems. By design, number one, we have reduced the entire discussions on what is green, what is not green, on their indexes. Clear examples. You want to judge that company or that other company, is we say is B minus, is 24 out of 60, is 6 out of 8. Literally a lot of numbers that are uncorrelated and unclear to everyone. Here, let me always say the solution next to the problem. To this unclarity of indexes, it's time to bring back real numbers and ask, what is the number of people, a number of women behind that company? What is the number of renewable energy behind that product? What is the number of emissions behind that company? And this is actually already like a revolution of simplicity and transparency. Second, now, in our attempt to move from that carbon tunnel we discussed before, from that risk of having the exaggerated simplicity of looking only at carbon emissions, now we have done the opposite mistake. Now we have indexes, as we said, that are composed of thousands and thousands of KPIs. I give you an example of some big companies that even brag to have 10,000 KPIs to assess the sustainability of a company. Let me be clear, I don't dislike precisions, but here we are running exactly another big risk. we're running the risk of creating an arbitrage by which each company can simply decide which story to tell. Because instead of focusing on few important common parameters that are comparable across companies, that are like clear, impactful for everyone, each one decides to narrate a different story that maybe I can like summarize with a Latin sentence. We say, corruptissima repubblica plurime leges. The more the laws, the more corrupt is the republic. And so it created a system that helps not those reading the information, but those literally writing the information. And this is actually the second big problem of ESG.
I'm presented with uncertainty, but at work, I become Forrest Gump and I just start running. Can you save me, Karen? What is the outcome here? That can you bring that learning or application, to who I am and to my assessment numbers, or to at least managing?
Yeah, absolutely. And I quite like the Forrest Gump analogy. It's Forrest Gump or it's head in the sand. It's like, no, that can't be true. That's not me. So like any assessment, this is a self-assessment. It's got various factors incorporated into it to ensure that if the person has over or underreported their behaviours because of a social desirability bias, that is, we can see that. So that's a good tangible piece of data to provide to the individual. But essentially, the report is linked to a number of skills as well to build your tolerance for ambiguity across the individual dimensions and elements. The interesting part was that the primary style to focus on, or skill, is around mindfulness. And so mindfulness being just to take that breath, take the moment, still the noise around you, be very, very present, get as focused as you can on what is happening. Don't take off like Forrest Gump. Don't start digging the hole to put your head in. Just sit with it and try and work out what's happening right here, right now. And then the second most highly correlated, there's 8 skills in total. The second most highly correlated skill is creativity. And of course, linked to how do I think differently about this new problem? I haven't seen this before. I can't just use the same hammer because the nail's different. I have to do it very differently. And then there's a number of other skills, including courageousness, curiosity, assertiveness, finding focus, flexible thinking, those sort of areas where the individual is really asked to sort of tap into skills that we almost had when we were a little at school and got beaten out of us somewhere through the education system as we age. But at no stage were any of the skills about develop another Gantt chart. Nothing like that from that perspective. Certainly finding focus and making sure you're doing, impacting the areas you can impact. But the idea of, the reams of paper and reporting, etc., that wasn't going to move the dial for the individuals in terms of how I feel. Because the first response is an emotional response, generally speaking, and it is also generally one that we consider to be a negative emotion, even though all emotions are there to send us a message. This negative emotion feels like fear, and we don't like it, and it makes us nervous, unhappy, angry, terrified, a lot of different emotions that we don't want to experience. So we run or we bury our head. But I believe, and it's a little bit tough to say maybe, but I believe that people's relevance in the workplace is significantly impacted by their desire to gain comfort and tolerance with ambiguity, because I'm almost positive it's not going away.
If these small landowners are doing this to make a living, to feed their family, or how do they decide not to? What is selling that profitable? What do they do after? What is the whole sort of continuation, if you will?
Yeah, and that right there, that is the $1 trillion question. That is the question that if we as humanity want to solve the deforestation problem, that's the question at the heart of it. How can we align economic interests with preserving forests? And so we initially didn't have that answer. We tried on a bunch of different solutions, and there are solutions floating around out there. There's kind of a few general tactics that conservationists will try to employ. I mean, ecotourism is a common alternative. The approach that we really found to be the most useful is shade-grown cacao. And so cultivating cacao trees in the shade of the forest, whether that's a cultivated forest or a secondary growth forest, but farming cacao trees and other fruit producing crops in a forest setting. So in other words, regenerative agroforestry.
Okay.
That to us was the most promising solution. And so this region, people already had a history of cultivating cacao. They had largely abandoned it because prices were so low and it was no longer generating a profit for them.
Okay.
So part of it was the task of how can we improve the prices that farmers are paid for cultivating cacao? How can we tie those high prices to biodiversity metrics? For example, it's not just about producing cacao and purchasing the cacao from those farms, but it's ensuring that the cacao is grown in a forest setting, it is grown beneath the shade of taller trees with a certain degree of biodiversity, and connecting those farmers with high-paying chocolate companies that are looking, whose customers themselves also want to support forest restoration rather than deforestation, and try to kind of close that gap and put all those pieces together so that it's all working together. You have farmers who are cultivating shade-grown cacao. You have chocolate companies who are paying a premium for cacao that's grown in the shade, and we're kind of marrying those two elements to create a project that works for all parties.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a two-pronged approach in both Washington and the Illinois legislation that focuses on kids as producers of media. And the first prong is about that lack of financial compensation, because when parents are consistently featuring their kids on a for-profit channel, their kids are often like used as the thumbnail of the video, as the clickbait. They're what's bringing the viewers in. And in doing so, they're getting eyes on like sponsorship deals and ads, and they're adding to the overall viewership of a channel. So the first prong of that legislation is, okay, these kids are bringing in views, and in many cases, that's bringing in revenue for the parents. So let's make sure these kids are compensated for the value that they're adding to the channel. The second aspect is, like you said, a lot of parents nowadays, now that we know more about social media and sort of its positive and negative effects, right? A lot of parents are teaching their kids to be good digital stewards, right? Don't share your full name, don't share your birthday, don't share your address, just like you mentioned. But the parents of these for-profit family vlogs oftentimes are reversing that, and they're sharing their kids' full names, they're sharing like where they're going to school. So all of this personal information is then being shared out to a wide viewership and monetized. And that's really what Quick Clean Kids aims to prevent in the future.
Ken, if I can jump in, I mean, I think what's really fascinating in this dialogue, and Chris actually made a really good point in a conversation a couple months ago, that this generation is the first generation to live their entire life in the eye of social media. And so if that's what's creating some barriers to regulation in the market, it's because this generation is just kind of entering the consumer market in a way that corporations and others haven't seen before. And so, I think about my 8-year-old daughter who consumes YouTube channels. And one day I was in the kitchen making something to eat, and I hear her down the hall in the bathroom. And literally she's standing in front of the mirror. I didn't know this, that I'm standing in front of the mirror going, she's got my makeup brush in hand, and she's apparently doing a makeup tutorial, because that's something that people do on YouTube. And she's like, click and like to subscribe, right? So when we talk about who to hold accountable in this, these kids are passive recipients. And I just spoke at a high school last week where half of the kids in the class described for me their career path as becoming professional influencers. So when we think about this as a place of work, when we think about this as an industry, when we think about this as a place to regulate, Chris is spot on that we are behind, quite frankly, in government regulation. We are behind in meeting the needs and the protections of these kids moving forward. And we've got to move faster and farther than we can possibly imagine to make sure that the next generation of kids is equally protected in this process.
About the Uganda satellite, it was more because one, Uganda last year in November launched its first satellite, the PAL-SAT-1, PAL-Africa-SAT-1, and the PAL-Africa-SAT-1. The interesting thing is I had a bit of foreknowledge about that satellite. I had participated in some of the works that led to that satellite being, getting to where it did. And one of my main concerns was that very many states that have launched satellites before or have engaged in space endeavors have often met themselves with the space curse, or you may call a space curse, getting into space, and then it has no benefit for the common man. And I did not want Uganda to reach or to be at that level. So while the satellite was a good idea for the country, it could very easily turn into a bad idea if it's mismanaged and mishandled. Mm-hmm. So I wrote that op-ed to basically show how can Uganda benefit from a satellite? How can Uganda succeed where many have failed? So at the end of the day, the satellite is not a white elephant for the state and for the common taxpayer, who has to keep funding a space program that is not profitable. Mm-hmm. So where for example, programs like NASA have been running for more than 60 years and used over $600 billion, younger programs can learn from the mistakes that the older ones have done so that they can mm-hmm. avoid those mistakes and then be able to grow their own space programs in a manner that is sustainable, but also profitable to not just the state, but also the common man. So that was the idea of writing that op-ed. And I hope that the powers that be and policymakers would be able to look at that and try to follow some of the recommendations I made therein.
I think what gives us hope around this is that we've seen examples in different countries, especially in the last 2 years, as reproductive rights have gone backwards in the US. As I mentioned earlier, like there's hope in the fact that there's been a lot of momentum and movement in other countries in a way, like Colombia, for example, where they completely decriminalized abortion up to 24 weeks. And there's no exception. Like you can, a person can have that regardless of the reason. So I feel like, to answer your question, like what can we do? A lot of it is like, for us, there's certain strategies we use. For example, there's a methodology called values clarifications. And one pillar of our work is around movement building and using evidence and like running these types of workshops. So even in Venezuela, there's parts of the country it's very challenging. So we have our local teams that go and run these workshops. And they're absolutely fascinating because there's good evidence to show when one person, like yourself, if you were going to do this, it allows you to face your values. In the beginning of a workshop, you'll be a certain way. And you'll see throughout the workshop, which is usually around 8 hours of the day, people can transform. Like there's been such amazing stories of that. And so that is the type of work, and like the work of, for us, it's like a lot of it being patient, being at the table. I also know, like, for example, there's people like, like males like yourself, but I also know, because I was at a conference in Aspen, there's also women, like this really beautiful story of South Carolina, where a Republican and a Democrat and independent, they all came together, and because they were like linked on this issue around abortion. So it's like finding these solidarities and linkages. And so they were able to block the law. I mean, then in the end, it got passed for the 6-week ban, but they were working together collectively across party lines. And that I think shows like a lot of promise that people are willing to like go beyond their party and the political views and try to change. I don't know, Jen, if you want to add anything else to that.
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. I mean, essentially, it's what Rupan said about the movement building, the education, and the advocacy. So, listening to your constituents if you're in a position of power. We know from the US that like when they try to pass referendums, in the end, the people actually want abortion care. They feel like that's their right. And so putting your ego aside and just being open to listening and destigmatizing the issue by talking about it more. So for example, we're partnered with a lot of advocacy partners like Shout Your Abortion that are just out there. People are talking about their stories, destigmatizing it, normalizing the conversation, and just asking questions and trying to put aside your own personal biases and being open to learning about the discourse and understanding different perspectives and points of views. And even if it's just a number point of view, back before Roe, that was the number one cause of young people, reproductive women, young cause of death was unsafe abortions. And as soon as Roe passed, like they got rid of the septic abortion wards that were basically filled and people were dying on these wards in the United States. So it's also just like looking at it maybe from a perspective that makes sense for you, and then expanding on it from there.
Once again, thank you for that. Thank you for the work that you do and for sharing these facts and insights today on Say Hi to the Future, and look forward to hearing more from you and your future successes in this really important area.
Thank you so much for having us.